Journal, and it's really a privilege for me to welcome him here to the Tenement Museum. Thank you.
Oh, I think this does work. Can you all hear me? Okay. All right. First, I think what I'd like to do is to get the Pulitzer thing out of the way. Everybody asks. It's the question that's usually first or second in the question and answer period. So I won for a book on polio. And the Pulitzer is the only prize where they do not announce the finalists in advance. For example, the National Book Award, there are 8 finalists. They all eat at the same table at the awards dinner. One wins, the other 7 make like they're happy for them. Kind of like the Oscars. But this one, they announced the finalists the same day, which I think is unusual and not particularly fair. But to make a long story short, a reporter called me up and asked me, he told me actually that I was one of 3 finalists for the award. And I was really surprised because you're not supposed to know that information. And I asked him who the other 2 finalists were, which I shouldn't have. And he said, one is at Harvard and is working on slavery, and the other is at Princeton and working on democracy. And I was at the University of Texas with polio. So I figured this is a complete non-starter. It was such a non-starter that on the day the prize was announced, my wife was in New Orleans visiting one of our children, certain we weren't going to win. And I called her up, and she was in a department store, and I said, Jane, we won, we won. And the store manager was standing there, and he said, what did he win? She said, my husband won the Pulitzer Prize. And the guy said, I thought it was Powerball. So there are limits to every award. In any event, Morris told me I have 15 or 20 minutes, so I'll get to the nub of it. I grew up as a baby boomer in Queens, New York. Thank you. Rego Park. You want the street? And for me, Bellevue was I will say it was sort of the crazy house. That's what Bellevue was known for. It had this gigantic psychiatric building, 8 stories high, 600 people, and it really was the depository for people who had been taken off the streets, or a judge had put them there, and then they would be evaluated and eventually either released or sent to another facility. But it was when I was acting quote unquote strangely, my mother would say, keep it up and you go into Bellevue. Bellevue was a punchline. And it was sort of fed to some degree by the fact that a lot of very famous writers went through, like William Burroughs, Norman Mailer, Delmore Schwartz, and they all wrote about this. And Miracle on 34th Street, the famous movie, Kris Kringle thinks he's Santa Claus, and what do? They send him to Bellevue for evaluation. So that was what Bellevue was known. On the other hand, we also knew that there was something unique about this hospital, meaning that when a cop was shot in New York City, he or she went to Bellevue. When a firefighter was overcome with smoke, Bellevue was the destination. When a homeless person was taken off the street, it was Bellevue. A worker falls off a scaffold, it was Bellevue. Bellevue had these amazing emergency facilities and trauma facilities, and that was sort of what it was known for secondarily. But what I tried to do in the book, because when I moved from Texas up, actually I have an office in Bellevue, was to try to find out what really made this hospital tick. And what was clear was that, A, it's the oldest public hospital in the United States. It goes back to the 1730s. And it also, and this is really most important, the mantra is that no one is turned away. Bellevue takes everybody. It's the hospital for the underserved. It was that way in the 1700s, the 1800s, while you had New York Hospital and Mount Sinai moving in other directions. Bellevue stayed as the premier public hospital. And what really got me kind of hooked was that I tried to find out who the first doctor was at Bellevue. When you think about the first doctor, and this was really in the late 18th century, you're talking about a bleeder and a purger. You know, these were men who had very little education, had no notion of germ theory, and basically bled and purged as a way of helping the patient. The man's name was Alexander Anderson, and he had left this remarkable diary at the New York Historical Society. And what was really extraordinary about Anderson was that he was 23 years old. He took the job because he basically had no other options at this point. He had trained and apprenticed with another physician. New York City at that time was undergoing an enormous yellow fever epidemic. There were yellow fever epidemics in New York City in the 1790s that killed substantial percentages of the population. And what is interesting is that in the 1790s, all of New York City was really down by the Battery. Washington Square was really the country, and Washington Square became the burial ground for yellow fever victims. And there are thousands and thousands of people buried in mass graves in Washington Square, and every time they do a kind of, you know, something to take care of the square and they have to dig down, bodies are always found and body parts are always found. They also had to find a place to put the epidemic victims. In other words, these were people who somehow had to be quarantined. No one knew what caused yellow fever, but they wanted them as far away as possible. And there was this old ramshackle estate on what is now 26th Street along the East River that was the Bellevue estate. And the city basically rented it and then purchased it, and that is where the yellow fever victims went. Now, Alexander Anderson, almost by himself with a very, very small staff, Alexander Anderson was forced to take care of dozens and dozens of victims who were brought up by boat along the East River or in dollies along cart paths. And what was extraordinary to me was the compassion that he showed for these people. His medical knowledge was basically nil in terms of saving anyone from yellow fever. But what he did was to give them compassionate care. And you look at that diary, you'll see two undertakers driving carts, and they're not treating the bodies with the respect that Anderson thinks they deserve, and he bawls them out. He fires what then passed for a nurse for being inebriated and not treating the patients with care. He basically tore into a physician who was running away from the yellow fever epidemic, claiming he wasn't doing his duty. Now, for Alexander Anderson, this was largely a religious duty. He was a very, very strong Christian, and he believed that he basically was sent by God to work at this God-forsaken pest house along the East River. What is really remarkable is that in the great yellow fever epidemic of 1798, Alexander Anderson leaves his family in a small house along Wall Street and goes to Bellevue. And in a period of 3 months, his father dies of yellow fever, his wife dies of yellow fever, his infant son dies of yellow fever, his brother dies of yellow fever, and his mother dies of yellow fever. The entire family is basically wiped out, but Alexander Anderson feels the call really to stay with the patients and to do God's work. And when you look at the last entry into his diary, into his medical diary in 1798, it's really New Year's Eve, he says, "A great catastrophe has befallen me and my family and the city, but it was God's will, basically, that I stay here, and what is written in the book of the future is not in my hands." And what really struck me is that through all of the other epidemics that have come through New York City and Bellevue, cholera, typhus, influenza, polio, AIDS, more patients with AIDS came to Bellevue and died at Bellevue than any other hospital in the United States. And they got very, very courageous care. It's not a perfect story. You know, there are lots of bumps along the road, but Bellevue, because on the one hand, it was very near Greenwich Village, and on the other hand, it's near the Lower East Side where there's a lot of drug addiction. Bellevue became ground zero for the AIDS epidemic, and it stayed the course. And, you know, just a couple of years ago, where was the lone Ebola victim in New York City, Craig Spencer? Where was he sent? He was sent to Bellevue. You know, that is what Bellevue does. It's the ultimate safety net for all of us. What really struck me, and I'll be very, very brief about this, what struck me about Bellevue was that on the one hand, you had the poorest people in New York City, those who had no other alternatives, who were coming to this hospital. It was a public hospital, and New York City, and we should be proud of this, is the only city in the United States that guarantees medical care, free medical care to the indigent. And that goes back a very long way. So Bellevue was the place these people went. On the other hand, Bellevue attracted some of the greatest medical talent in the United States, generation after generation, to come and work there. Why? Some clearly felt it was their moral and religious duty to do so. Others believed that when you went to Bellevue, there was nothing you didn't see. You saw everything. And finally, and I have instances in my book, you could basically do what you wanted to do on uncomplaining bodies. So a lot of experimentation went on at Bellevue. Now, it wasn't Frankenstein-like experimentation. It was experimentation that was trying to push the medical envelope forward, but still you had the director of child psychiatric services in the 1930s, a pioneer in autism named Loretta Benda, a woman who was one of the very few at that time who did not blame the mother and the coldness of the mother for causing autism. She thought there were deep psychiatric and probably genetic reasons for this. But Loretta Benda, basically in trying to break through these children, was using electric shock on kids 3 and 4 years old, on hundreds of them. That, to some degree, is went on at Bellevue. We also won Nobel Prizes for cardiac catheterization. But you look who goes through this hospital. Walter Reed of yellow fever fame went through this hospital. Joseph Goldberger, who figured out that pellagra was a nutritional disease, went to Bellevue. Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin both went through Bellevue. And there is, you know, it's interesting, when I tell my class that the two fathers of the two great polio vaccines both went to NYU Medical School, which was the great feeder of Bellevue Hospital, and then on to Bellevue, a lot of them say, oh my goodness, what a coincidence. It was no coincidence. NYU in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, along with Bellevue Hospital, were basically the only places on the East Coast that didn't have a Jewish quota. Every other place, you look at Cornell, you look at P&S Columbia, Harvard, Penn, Yale, they all had very strict Jewish quotas. NYU did not, and Bellevue did not. And therefore, Salk and Sabin went there because essentially it was the only game in town. And that's something I think Bellevue and NYU should be very proud of. I'll tell you one other sort of story about Bellevue, and then I'll turn the microphone over to Morris. In the late 19th century, Bellevue physicians and surgeons treated 4 American presidents, all of whom were in desperate condition. You may not know this, but a young Army surgeon who had just graduated from Bellevue Medical College named Charles Augustus Leal was the man who rushed to Abraham Lincoln's box at Ford's Theater. He just happened to buy a ticket that night and was with Lincoln for the next 18 hours until Lincoln died. And Charles Augustus Leal made some important decisions. He made some decisions that weren't the right decisions. It didn't matter. The president was mortally, he was dead, essentially. But Charles Augustus Leal did the best he could. And what to me really sort of was the essence of this young Bellevue graduate was that he held Abraham Lincoln's hand until the moment Lincoln died. He sat across from Lincoln, and when he was asked later, why did he do this? He said, I wanted the president to know in his blindness that he had a friend. And I thought, you know, that is the Bellevue credo. We had some physicians who did not do as well. You may know that James A. Garfield was the next president to be assassinated after Abraham Lincoln. But what we also know today is that Garfield suffered 2 bullet wounds, one of which was superficial and the second of which was not fatal. If Garfield had simply been left alone and sewn up in an antiseptic method, he would have been fine. But the greatest surgeon of that era, a military surgeon from Bellevue named Frank Hamilton, who did not believe in Listerian medicine, thought Pasteur was a crazy Frenchman. Frank Hamilton went down to Washington and put his finger deep into Garfield's wounds. He used unsterilized probes, and Garfield, who was shot weighing 200 pounds, died 3 months later weighing less than 100 pounds, and the autopsy showed just massive infection. In other words, Garfield, I don't want to go far enough to say that Frank Hamilton killed Garfield, but he sure as hell didn't help him, okay? Let me come full circle on this, and then I'll try to wrap it up a bit. About 2 decades later, Grover Cleveland, who, as many of you know, was from New York State, Grover Cleveland went to his Bellevue doctor, and he said, I have a lesion in my mouth. And the doctor looked at it and said, I think it's cancer. This was in the 1890s. And we're going to send it down to the great pathologist, William Welsh, in Baltimore to have a look at it. And it came back, and it was cancer. This was during the Depression of 1893, and Garfield did not want his opponents to know that he was in a very precarious position. He thought it would panic the nation and give the Republicans sort of a leg up in the next election. So what Cleveland said was, I will have an operation, but it must be secret. And amazingly, a very wealthy Wall Street banker volunteered his yacht. The yacht was outfitted by 3 Bellevue surgeons into an operating room. It sailed up the East River. As it passed Bellevue, the shades were drawn. It went out into the quietest part of the Long Island Sound, and in a 90-minute operation, Cleveland's lesion was removed, and it was done with perfect antiseptic precision. Everything had been sterilized. And every probe, Cleveland himself had his mouth washed out with antiseptic. Everything was starched and ready. So I think and Grover Cleveland survived. He did die, but it was, 20 years later of a heart attack. So what you can say is that there's kind of a full circle here, that what was begun by Charles Augustus Leal and followed further by Frank Hamilton kind of came full circle. And you can actually make the argument, I think, that the death of Garfield basically saved the life of Grover Cleveland. The important thing is that every one of these people was treated by a Bellevue physician. What I want to say in closing, and Morris and I will get further into this, is that Bellevue is the immigrants' hospital. If you go to Bellevue today, more than 100 languages are spoken. A doctor will put on headphones, a patient will put on headphones, there'll be an interpreter, and that is the way it is done. And it's done that way because Bellevue's patients come from all over the world. They come from Haiti. They come from Latin America. They come from all parts of Asia and Africa. And they know when they come to Bellevue, if they have a medical emergency, they will not be turned away. Not a majority, but a very large share of our patients today are undocumented, undomiciled, meaning homeless, and uninsured. Bellevue asks no questions. We have been doing this for 300 years. We have been treating the immigrant class and the underclass of New York City with a kind of top-flight medicine and with a passion that I think is very, very unusual. Have there been issues? Yes. I'll give you one quick example before I quit. In 1990, a young pregnant pathologist at Bellevue was raped, sodomized, and murdered by a homeless man who was living in the hospital. He was squatting in the hospital. And the reason was that the gigantic Bellevue psychiatric facility had been turned into the largest men's homeless shelter in New York City and is still there. And what happened quite naturally is that since Bellevue was so open and welcoming, the public facilities in the hospital became kind of an extension of the homeless shelter. You had patients who were having their food stolen off their trays by homeless people. Homeless people were living in the various lounges. And Bellevue had to come to a real decision, and that decision was, as much as we take everyone in who needs medical care, we are a hospital, not a homeless shelter and not a bus station. And it was a very hard hurdle to go over, given the long history of giving and kindness in our facility. Today, our doors are open. Hurricane Sandy almost took us out. We were closed for the first time in our history for 6 months, and we had one of the most heroic evacuations on record. Some of you may not know it, but Bellevue has not only several floors of psychiatric wards, the entire 19th floor at Bellevue is a prison ward. All the prisoners from Rikers Island, the male prisoners with medical or psychiatric issues, come to Bellevue. They had to be evacuated in Hurricane Sandy in the darkness, daisy chained together and surrounded by corrections officers. Psychiatric patients came down. Neonatal unit patients came down. ICU patients came down. It was the largest vertical evacuation in American history. And again, what it stands for, I think, is the commitment of the people who work in that hospital. Physicians, technicians, nurses, people who work in the kitchens and the like. It's a wonderful place. It's got a history that is basically parallels the history of American medicine, the history of public health, the history of immigration. And I encourage you all, my office is on the 6th floor, come visit. Thank you very much. I'll go into here now.
Either one.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David. Your passion for the story and for the institution rings true. I mean, there's a reason for it, and I very much appreciate that. So, in talking to us about Salk and Sabin, mentioning them, their stories, you suggest that there's an immigrant dimension that the Bellevue story reflects. And what I wonder is whether there are other elements of New York's immigrant story on which Bellevue offers instructive windows that you might want to follow up on.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Every immigrant group that came to the United States has used Bellevue as its hospital. The Irish came on the famine ships in the 1830s. The belief was that they had brought cholera with them. Some of you may know that in the 1830s there was a mass exodus from New York City because of the great cholera epidemic. It was centered in Irish neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods for the obvious reason that it was polluted drinking water. The wells were polluted. These people lived in the worst kind of pre-tenements. I invite you all to go through this this wonderful facility.
That wasn't the point of the question, by the way, though. I very much appreciate
thank
that
you.
part of the
I just
answer.
thought I'd put a plug in. What happens is that after the Irish come, typhus becomes the next sort of epidemic disease, and that involves the Germans and the Irish. And then Jews come, and the belief is that Jews are bringing with them tuberculosis or Taylor's disease, and Bellevue becomes the place where they had treated. When you talk about polio, it is basically seen as the Italian disease coming from a certain neighborhood in Brooklyn. Bellevue was the place where they went. Influenza hit the poor neighborhoods of New York City in 1918, 1919 with a vengeance. These were largely immigrant communities. So the connection is what, the best way I could answer this, Morris, is to say that the immigrant groups have now changed. In other words, the Irish are gone. There are very few Irish at Bellevue now. The Jews are gone. The Italians are gone. But an entire new group of immigrants have come, and they use Bellevue in the same way that the old immigrants did. It's this endless pattern of the treatment of people fresh off the boat and the people basically who have no other options. And even in the case of Jews, I'll tell you one really sort of interesting story that may get to what you're talking about. Mount Sinai originally was called Jews Hospital, and it was built in the 1850s. But Mount Sinai was also constructed and run by German Jews who were kind of very skittish about the new immigrants who were coming, the new Jewish immigrants who were coming from Central and Eastern Europe. And what Mount Sinai began to do during this influx was to privatize much of its hospital and lower the percentage of charity patients in this hospital, meaning that Bellevue was forced to take the overflow. And what I found time and again is that when you see the writings of Jewish immigrants, they are much more comfortable in Bellevue, which is a more primitive environment, because they are not having that kind of judgmental sense of German Jews looking down upon them. Bellevue is their hospital. It's always been the immigrants' hospital and remains so to this day. You come to Bellevue, we have some Bellevue people here. Very little English is spoken today among the patients in Bellevue. And it's a wonderful thing to see and hear.
It's often said that New York City renews itself as an immigrant city through the waves of immigrants who have come here. And obviously, that's a feature of our economy, that the city offers opportunity. But it's also noted that many of our institutions are particularly welcoming, whether it be the public schools or the city university, that these give the city a certain kind of a caste, a certain almost welcoming mien. Is Bellevue, is the city's health and hospital system part of that? Is this part of the welcome that New York City extends?
It is, and it always has been. The problem you run into, Morris, is that we had 19 public hospitals in New York City in the 1930s, and we're down under a dozen today. Public hospitals are hemorrhaging money. They're getting less money from the federal government, from the state, from Medicaid. So you have to make do with what you have. But Bellevue clearly has been sort of the beacon, like the public schools. And I'll give you an example of this. You have there was a man named Lewis Thomas, a wonderful physician who was chief of staff at Bellevue and actually won the National Book Award for his essays. And there had been a time, amazingly, when Columbia Cornell, and NYU all serviced Bellevue. It was the teaching hospital for all three. In the 1960s, Columbia and Cornell left. They were no longer at Bellevue. They had, geographically, they were a bit further away. They had their own teaching hospitals. And there was clearly a class dimension to this as well. And Lou Thomas, who was not Jewish, Lou Thomas said, in a way, goodbye and good riddance. You know, we thank you for all you have done, but there is something about NYU medical school graduates. They've come through the New York public school system. They come from the ethnic groups of New York City. They identify with the patients who are here in ways that doctors from, at least in the 50s and 60s and before, at Columbia and Cornell could not do. So it's a public hospital, but it's an incredibly welcoming hospital, staffed entirely now by one medical school, and that is NYU. NYU Medical Center provides all of the house staff, the attendings, and the medical students at Bellevue Hospital. And the diversity at NYU and the connection to the city itself is extraordinary.
There's a heavy focus on physicians in the book.
Right.
And I wonder if there are any immigration narratives in that you'd like to explore.
I think there are all kinds of immigration narratives. And, they come from, Salk and Sabin would be the obvious one. Dr. Cournand came from France and basically you could consider him almost to be a Holocaust refugee, and would go on to win the Nobel Prize at Bellevue for cardiac catheterization. Joseph Goldberger, who basically came from the streets, a Jewish kid, went through, Bellevue and basically found the cause of pellagra, working for the Public Health Service. There are endless narratives of Jewish men and women, I might add, at Bellevue Hospital. Women play an enormous role in pushing the medical envelope forward there. So I think those matter. And I would also say that I do have an entire chapter on sort of the growth of nursing in the United States and the fact that it did begin at Bellevue Hospital. So I don't want to just make it like the focus is entirely on physicians and the medical care they give. If ever you've seen a hospital where you have a team effort, historically, it's this hospital.
Your narrative encompasses the grand sweep of American medical history. You're in a position now to tell us what you think some of the high points of that are.
Well, that's a very good question. When you study medical history, one of the things you notice is that until the 19th century, we were in the dark ages, not only in the United States. There was virtually no laboratory work going on. Nobody had a clue about vaccines and vaccination except in the most primitive possible way. People believed in the miasma theory, that disease was basically caused by clouds of germs that descended upon certain areas. There was no notion that invisible microbes were incredible. The things you didn't see were the things that could really kill you. So what you have at Bellevue, and because there are so many patients and there's so much to do with them, you can really run through the growth of vaccination, anesthesia, public health, germ theory, and just sort of move it forward into the 20th century now to the human genome theory. So it's Bellevue is the history of American medicine.
But we're now in the 21st century. What's it got to say about the future?
Well, okay. I'm optimistic. I mean, I was interviewing a very distinguished Bellevue researcher today who said that in 30 years, your entire medical history is going to be on a chip, literally on a chip. That people.
It's actually in my iPhone already.
Yes, right.
Right.
You're close enough, right? And it's very possible that in 50 years, people will be looking back at something like chemotherapy and wondering if that was akin to bleeding in the 19th century. Who knows? But what I would say is that if you were to look at a surgical procedure in an American hospital in the 1830s, there was no anesthesia. So basically, the operation had to be done in seconds. An arm had to be taken off literally in seconds, or else the patient would die of shock. And you can imagine the pain. And at Bellevue, other hospitals as well, but at Bellevue, the surgeons would actually say to the patient, your arm must come off. Do you want your arm to come off? They would ask the patient that. If the patient said no, that was it. If the patient said yes, the patient was brought to the operating theater, and at that time it was on a very, very high floor because they wanted sunlight and they wanted to muffle the screams for those below. And they would take off the arm whether you wanted it, and the pain was excruciating. You move forward now 30 years, and anesthesia is in full bloom, but half the patients who are being operated on at Bellevue are dying of postoperative infection. And what you have now, which was fought out more at Bellevue Hospital than at any American hospital, is the beginning of antiseptic medicine and the acceptance of germ theory. When you put those two halves of the walnut together, you have an operation that will help the patient or her and not kill her. And that is one of the reasons why by the 1890s, even the middle class in New York City began to understand that it was better to go to a hospital for certain procedures than to have it done in your home. There was no reason not to have it done in your home until the 1890s. But now they had x-rays, they had laboratories, they had germ theory, and at places like New York Hospital and Mount Sinai, they had private rooms and really good food. So they were actually catering to private patients. Bellevue never had that issue, to put it mildly. But those are some of the ways you really trace the growth of American medicine.
David, you're a great historian. I asked you about the 21st century, and as I would do if someone did that, I'd go back to the 19th.
Okay, well,
what I want.
Okay, I mean, what I will say is that there are some disturbing signals right now. For example, life expectancy in the United States has flattened. It was going up, it was going up, it was going up, and in recent years it has flattened out. If you're a woman in Japan, in the next 10 years you can probably expect to live on average to 90. Women outlive men in the United States by about 4 or 5 years, but those numbers have begun to flatten out. And what we're talking about are not infectious issues, Morris, but kind of chronic issues like diabetes, obesity, heart disease, and the like, which are really taking a toll. The one thing I would say that frightens me the most about the 20th century is the future of my hospital. Okay? Public hospitals are going to have to reinvent themselves to survive. They are not getting enough money, and most people will not go to a public hospital if they have an alternative like insurance. Okay? They will go somewhere else. And even at Bellevue, if you need a very serious operation, there's no better place to go. But if you got to recuperate, it might not be a bad idea to go somewhere else. Bellevue is losing patients. It is hemorrhaging money. We all believe that Obamacare would be, in some ways, something that would bail us out. But one of the things you may not know about Obamacare is that you cannot join an exchange if you are undocumented. Okay? So what Obamacare was premised on was kind of the notion that the federal government could start paying less in payments to public hospitals for the uninsured because more of these people would get private insurance or join a kind of co-op. On the other hand, we deal with so many people who just don't have that option. And what we are wrestling with now is how we are going to find city money, which is very generous, Medicaid money, and federal money, which goes what's called a disproportionate plan, which goes to hospitals that disproportionately treat the uninsured. That money is beginning to dry up. And it probably would have dried up as well as Obama, with President Obama, and it's certainly, I think, going to dry up in the future. Bellevue is iconic. It's got a great history. New Yorkers love it. So I don't think Bellevue is in great trouble, but many of the other facilities are. And the de Blasio administration has been, I think, fairly good, but medical care is moving now to outpatient clinics, ambulatory services, preventive medicine, and the notion of hospitals, particularly public hospitals, are somewhat in jeopardy.
Thanks, David. So what I want to do now, do we have a microphone in the audience? We do. So if you've got a question, raise your hand, and Laura Lee, who is standing there in the middle with a microphone, will come to you.
First one is always the hardest.
You painted a very rosy picture, and I'd like to ask you if you've thought in your book about some of the little more negative aspects of Bellevue. And one of the things that I knew Bellevue well in the 60s and 70s, and one of the things that bothered me being there was that it was like a class difference. The medical staff was certainly of a different socioeconomic level than the other people, and that had negative implication. I'll just very briefly, since I'm not lecturing here. Two, you may have come in your readings about a pediatrician named Krugman. Do you remember him?
Yeah.
Who essentially thought to study the natural history of hepatitis virus, went to Willowbrook and gave the kids hepatitis. This wasn't good. And another thing that I remember well when I first came there. Shortly before I arrived, a young Spanish woman died from a diagnostic procedure, and she'd had a common renal disease, and the attending physician, who was a great renologist, said, "Well, I want the students to see the biopsy, so let's biopsy her." And she died from that. And there was a small bunch of the house staff that really were enraged by that. Yeah. But in general, the house staff accepted it as being part of the thing.
That's a very fair question. I'll try to answer it in two ways. I think there's always going to be somewhat of a class difference, but I will tell you, working at Bellevue, that the people there, they're like Bellevue lifers. They've been there 40, 50 years. They are so devoted to that place. You're absolutely right. Needle biopsies, it was kind of a scandal at the time you were there. Many of them, and they were being given to Bowery derelicts in the name of science, and this was an issue. My book is a warts and all book. I mean, and that is in the book. As for Dr. Krugman, I am not here to defend him, but there are two sides to that story. For those of you who don't know, and I'll go into it very briefly, he was the head of pediatrics at NYU and also worked part-time at Bellevue. And he went to Willowbrook, and some of you may know Willowbrook. It was on Staten Island. It was a hospital for the really seriously mentally impaired children. And Krugman was working on a hepatitis vaccine. And there is no doubt that Krugman fed live hepatitis virus to some of those children. Today, that is something that would never be done, never be done. Now, this was a strain of virus that was in no way fatal, but it still was live virus. Krugman's argument was that the vast majority of kids at Willowbrook were going to get hepatitis anyway. It was understaffed, there was feces everywhere, and therefore what he was actually doing was trying to figure out, since these kids were going to get it anyway, to figure out a way to find a vaccine that would help stem hepatitis. And this is not a means justify the ends, but he did help find that vaccine. So there's much to be said against Dr. Krugman, but there is something to be said in his favor as well. Okay. But thank you. That's a very smart question.
Hi.
Hi.
So I work for the city. I work for the Department of Health in the Bureau of Environmental Disease, and we have a joint program, the Poison Control Center, that is shared between us and Bellevue. And I don't know the history of it. I was wondering if you could speak at all to the Poison Control Center and its relationship.
There actually, with environmental health, there are a number of centers. Poison control, as I mentioned in my book, actually comes out of the 1920s, and it comes out of the Prohibition era, when there was so much dangerous wood alcohol being passed around in New York City that, particularly on holidays, there would be these epidemics of people coming into Bellevue who had been poisoned by bad alcohol, by bathtub gin. If you were rich during Prohibition, it was not you got your booze from Canada, or you got it smuggled in by, the Capone gang or something. It was not an issue. But for many, many New Yorkers, it was a huge issue. And in fact, what is really amazing about it is that the Department of Forensic Medicine, the first in the country, begins at Bellevue Hospital, and it literally begins because of the poisoning. And one other thing I will say is that the guy who gave money for this originally was Mayor Jimmy Walker. Kind of, he's a long story, but Jimmy Walker despised Prohibition, and he wanted every bad story about Prohibition to come out. And of course, the poisoning of poor people was very, very high on the list. The other major environmental institution at Bellevue is pulmonary, and that is a function of 9/11. In other words, there are thousands of people in this city who were kind of poisoned by toxic fumes, particularly the first responders and the people who worked down there and survived and cleaned up the mess. And Bellevue has gotten a very, very large sum of money to deal with these particular people. And we also have, as some of you Bellevue people know in yours, kind of a simulation center that goes along with that is absolutely extraordinary. Yes.
Hi, could you talk a little bit about the psychiatric side of the hospital, the history, and what it's like now?
Sure. Bellevue was always the place in New York City where if you were picked up off the street, if your family thought that you were having serious issues, you would generally go to police court, and they would send you to Bellevue for observation, generally for no more than 60 days. Bellevue got the reputation for being the quote-unquote crazy house because a young female journalist named Nellie Bly, kind of working for Joseph Pulitzer's New York World, began to try to find a story in which she could get herself into Bellevue and then the so-called Octagon, which is in the East River, which is the state facility. So she sort of faked being quote-unquote crazy, got herself admitted to Bellevue. The doctors, the psychiatry it wasn't even called psychiatry. They're called alienists at the time in the 1880s. They misdiagnosed her. They sent her on. They said she was crazy. They sent her on. And she wrote a book called 10 Days in a Madhouse. And it was that book more than anything else that really gave Bellevue a reputation it could never shake. Now, what I will say is that Bellevue then did build a psychiatric hospital next to the main buildings. And that psychiatric hospital is still there. It's 600 beds, but it is now the men's homeless shelter, the main men's homeless shelter in New York City. But psychiatry is one of the major elements of the hospital. Psychiatric treatment at Bellevue, I think, is first rate. I'm not an expert on this. There's been a lot of experimentation that has gone on there. Electric shock has come back, although for adults. And it is I would say it is one of the two largest units now in the hospital. So psychiatry is basically a thriving department, both at NYU and in the hospital itself. A lot of these people are kind of what you would call repeats. Many of them are homeless. They come in for very short periods of time, they leave, and then they're back. So we generally don't treat people over long periods of time.
No, please wait for the microphone because we're broadcasting.
So I recall there was a movie made some time ago about drug dealing and I think murder in the underground labyrinth of Bellevue carried out by employees, but I can't remember the name of it. Does that ring a bell?
I am unfamiliar with, there was a very famous case in the 1890s where 3 male nurses killed a psychiatric patient, but I have no notion of the movie you're talking about or any incident quite like that. What I will say for those, particularly for those Bellevue folks, is that we do have quite a basement. And at one point, there was a tunnel from the psychiatric building into the main hospital. And as some of you may know, during Hurricane Sandy, it was largely the Bellevue basement that was wiped out. It took quite a while to restore it.
Hi, I'm fascinated that you're a professor of medicine and the humanities. And I wondered, how do you function in the hospital and the medical school?
Well, I'm not a doctor, but at Bellevue I am still allowed to do surgery. No, I'm a PhD. What I do at Bellevue, actually not at Bellevue, but at NYU Medical School, which treats me and the Division of Medical Humanities very generously. What we found out was that as medicine became very technological, there was a hunger on the part of students for literature about medicine, art about medicine, medical history, writing medical narrative. Eli, where are you? In the back? Eli is one of our most accomplished. He's going to be a wonderful physician. His mom is a doctor and is here. And Eli spends a lot of time basically in the medical humanities because he feels that not only does it broaden him as a person, but it brings the patient connection closer. And I hope Eli is right. He's actually studying that as we speak, whether there's any correlation. If it turns out there is no correlation, I will bury the study. No.
In the finest tradition of the sciences.
Yes, right, exactly.
Hi, I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about when Bellevue and maybe NYU started hiring black physicians and nurses.
That's a good question. Bellevue has had a very, very good record in hiring Caucasian minorities. It's had a very good record, a record better than most when it comes to female physicians. It has been rather unsuccessful in dealing with African American physicians and recruiting them. We are doing our best. We may be slightly better than other hospitals, but there are not that many African American physicians. We really desperately need them. Oh, I'm sorry. The first African American physician at NYU and at Bellevue was in the 1920s. What is interesting is that he graduated, and then May Chin was the first female. His name was, I think, Aubrey Maynard. He's in my book. Dr. Maynard was not allowed to be, even though he graduated from NYU Medical School, he was not taken as a resident of Bellevue And in an interview with May Chin, she said they thought he was, quote unquote, too dark, and he would frighten white women patients. What I will say about Aubrey Maynard is that he went to Harlem Hospital, became a leading surgeon, and in 1956 or 57, a young preacher, a young minister in Harlem was signing books, and he was stabbed, and it missed his aorta by less than an inch. And Aubrey Maynard was called in to remove that scissor and to sew up the aorta. And that minister was the young Martin Luther King Jr. That's right. It was a letter opener. He was stabbed, yeah. I'm sorry? Oh, that I didn't know. That I didn't know. Amazing.
Hello.
Hi.
You've talked about Bellevue as a public hospital, and in that respect, it's a real cultural outlier. I'm a recent immigrant, and I come from a country where we have a significant public healthcare system. And I wonder if you can talk to me a little bit, help me understand a little bit about why it's such a cultural abnormality here.
You got an hour? The best way to put it is to say that, you know, America has always had public hospitals, but in the 1890s, and Morris has written about this, in the 1890s in particular, religious hospitals, voluntary hospitals really began to take over. And now we have for-profit hospitals. And what a for-profit hospital really means is that you get a bunch of people who invest in it, and they do not get any tax breaks or tax exemptions like a public hospital would be, or even a voluntary hospital, but they get to split up all the profits. A voluntary hospital would be something like Tisch Hospital, which is the other. NYU has Tisch Hospital, it's got Bellevue, and it also treats the VA. Tisch Hospital is a voluntary hospital, which means that it does get tax abatements and tax breaks, but it also has to spend a certain amount of its time, energy, and finances helping the poor, and it does. And then you have public hospitals, which basically get, in New York, they get city money, they get state money, they get federal money, and there are no donors. We do not have buildings named after people at Bellevue. You know, at other hospitals, there's this pavilion and that pavilion. We're a public hospital. So basically, we get our money when we can from the patients and their insurance, and other than that, from the state. And that is the way it has been in the United States for a century and a half. We do not have socialized medicine, and we do not have a system that, are you from Australia, I gather, or? Oh, the UK, oh, okay. We have very different lobbies here, and I really can't get into many great detail, but we're not going to change in the near future.
We've got time for one more question.
Yes. I'm sorry.
Hi. You mentioned about the need for Bellevue to reinvent itself going forward. Could you give a few examples of the kinds of ideas that are afloat, if you can?
Yeah. When a public hospital, for example, if you were to look at, I'm not sure Bellevue could ever do this, but if you would look at a hospital like Jackson Memorial in Florida, which was the great public hospital in Miami, Jackson Hospital and also Grady Hospital in Atlanta now have begun to add people to the board who are not affiliated with the city. They're in private industry. They now have philanthropists who are giving money to that hospital in ways that the New York City system is not set up to do. And I'm not sure we will ever be set up to do that. I think what we really need at a place like Bellevue, where we are, do not have enough staff and do not have enough finances, is just to keep lobbying the city to provide the funds to keep these hospitals going. And believe me, the voluntary hospitals want Bellevue to be around, because Bellevue is the safety net for the patients they will take until insurance runs out, or it's a very complicated case, or the person is homeless and has multiple medical issues. I don't want to get into what you might call patient dumping, but Bellevue is the safety net for that as well. So in a sense, I think it's really up to us to talk about how important this hospital is, the services it's provided for centuries, and the fact that we have a whole new group of immigrant communities who are depending on that hospital, its emergency services, its outpatient clinics, and we will be a very, very different, smaller, weaker, and less humane place without it.
Thank you so much, David.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I want to remind you that Bellevue, 3 centuries of medicine and mayhem at America's most storied hospital, is available at the counter at a 15% discount. While you're back there getting a copy that David will sign, you can get a beer also. We've got beer and books back. And thank you all for coming. You're terrific. It's a lot of fun. We should take this on the road.
Yeah, we should.
He's going to sign.
I have mine already.
Okay. Will you stand up here?